How does a story cross an ocean before anyone has built a ship to cross it? That is the question that has kept me awake on more nights than I would like to admit. Because the story I am talking about is everywhere. It surfaces in the snowmelt rivers of northern India and in the muddy floodplains of ancient China. It is told around fires in the forests of North America, and it is pressed into clay in the deserts of the Middle East. A man, a warning, a rising water that swallows the world. A boat, a handful of survivors who climb down afterward and begin again. Different languages, different gods, different names for the man who builds the boat, and underneath all of it, the same shape, the same fear, the same flood. People who could not possibly have spoken to one another, separated by mountains, by oceans, by thousands of years, somehow ended up telling the same nightmare. And the deeper you dig into where that nightmare came from, the stranger the answer becomes. Let me show you how wide this thing runs. In the sacred texts of ancient India, in the Shatapatha Brahmana, and later in the Matsya Purana, there is a man named Manu. One morning he is washing his hands in a river when a small fish asks him for protection. The fish is not a fish, it is the god Vishnu in disguise. It warns Manu that a great flood is coming, and it tells him to build a boat. So he does. The waters rise, the world drowns, and the fish guides his boat to the peak of a mountain. When the waters fall, Manu climbs down and starts the human race over again. In his version, he carries something Noah never thought to save: the Vedas, the sacred knowledge itself, so that wisdom survives the water along with the man. Travel east into China, and there is a flood there too, though, as you will see, a far stranger one. Cross the Pacific, and the first peoples of the Americas tell their own versions. The Ojibwe, the Aztec with their two survivors, Tata and Nina. The Maya cross back to Europe, and the Greeks have Deucalion, the Norse a frost giant named Bergelmir. And then there is the one almost everyone in the Western world grows up with. A man named Noah, an ark, 2 of every animal, 40 days of rain, a dove sent out across grey water, returning at last with a single olive leaf. Now here's what I find striking. When you lay these stories side by side, the overlaps are almost too clean to be coincidence. A divine being, angry or grieving, decides to wash the slate clean. One righteous person is warned in advance. A vessel is built. The animals are spared. The water comes. The world ends. And from the survivors, everything begins again. According to the British Museum, where some of the oldest written versions of this story are kept, the same handful of elements keeps repeating: a divine cause, a warning given beforehand, a chosen few, the animals, the boat, across cultures that had no apparent way of reaching one another. So the obvious conclusion, the one people have reached for centuries, is this: it must have really happened. One enormous flood, somewhere deep in the human past, witnessed by everyone, remembered by everyone, handed down until it hardened into scripture. They were not inventing a myth. They were remembering a catastrophe. It is a beautiful idea. Part of me wants it to be true. But the way I read the evidence, the truth is more tangled and in some ways more interesting. What strikes me most is not the similarities, it is the disagreements. Take China. Under the Emperor Yao, the rivers overflow for 2 full generations. But the hero of that story, a man named Yu, does not build a boat and float above the chaos. He picks up a shovel, he cuts drainage channels, hauls away the mud, and forces the water back into its banks by sheer engineering. He does not survive the flood, he defeats it, and he goes on to found the first dynasty in Chinese history. That is not the same nightmare as Noah. In a way, it is the opposite of it, a story not about divine punishment, but about human mastery. Then there is the silence, in the one place you would most expect a flood. Ancient Egypt, a civilization built entirely upon a river that flooded every single year, has no great deluge myth at all. For the Egyptians, the rising water was not the end of the world, it was the gift that fed it. So if the flood was a single global event, burned into the memory of all mankind, why did the Egyptians, of all people, forget it? And why did the Chinese remember it backward? The question nobody asks is which of these stories came first, and whether they are even truly the same story at all. Here is where the honest answer lives. There is one cluster of these tales, the ones from the ancient Near East, the flat country between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, where the connection is no mystery at all. According to the scholars who can read the script they were written in, you can trace the line almost like a family tree, one telling descending from another. The Hebrew story of Noah did not appear out of nowhere. It has older relatives, much older ones, written down in wedge-shaped cuneiform on tablets of baked clay, in cities that had already crumbled to dust before the Book of Genesis was ever composed. And that is the part that tends to unsettle people. Most of us are taught, quietly or out loud, that the Genesis flood is the original, the first telling, the source from which the rest flowed. Tradition holds it that way, but the clay tablets tell a different story. They were pressed into wet earth by scribes who lived and prayed and died centuries before the first word of the Bible was set down. Same flood, same boat, the same birds released to test the falling water, just older, hauntingly older. So which is it? Did every culture remember one real flood, or did they each invent their own? The honest answer is that scholars still argue about it, and the argument splits roughly 3 ways. The first idea is descent, that the story spread outward from a single origin, carried by traders and travelers from one people to the next, changing shape as it traveled. The second is independent invention, that any civilization built on a flat river plain will, sooner or later, watch the water rise and swallow everything it loves, and will reach for a story to carry the grief. They did not copy one another, they simply lived the same geography. The third idea, the most speculative, is that something in the human mind itself keeps reaching for the flood, that we are somehow wired to imagine the world washed clean and started fresh. If you ask me, notice what all 3 of those explanations share. None of them require a worldwide ocean. They require something quieter and far more haunting, that the fear of losing everything in a single night is so universal, so deeply human, that we keep writing it down in every language we have ever invented. What this tells us is not really about water at all. It is about how we hold on to the worst thing that could happen and pass it, carefully, to the people who come after us. You might think this is ancient history, but replace the flood with a pandemic, a war, a market that collapses overnight, and you are reading a very modern fear wearing very old clothes. The water changes, the dread does not. Here is the question I keep returning to. If the Genesis flood was not the first telling, if there were older boats and older arks and older men warned by older gods, then who told it first? Who pressed the very first version of this story into the clay, and what did they believe was drowning? History doesn't teach us that the past is settled. It teaches us that the oldest stories are often the ones we understand the least. Somewhere beneath the sand of southern Iraq, in the ruins of the first cities human beings ever built, that first story lay waiting. It had been waiting for nearly 5,000 years, and the reason it gives for why the world was destroyed is not the reason any of us were raised to expect. The room was cold, and it smelled of dust and old paper and the river fog that crept up from the Thames and settled into the stone. It was the autumn of 1872, in a back room of the British Museum in London, and a man sat hunched over a wooden table, holding a piece of broken clay no bigger than his hand. His fingers were stained with ink. They had been stained for years, and he was staring at the dirt caked into the grooves of that tablet the way another man might stare at a locked door he had no key for. His name was George Smith. He was 32 years old, and in the next few minutes he was going to read a sentence that no living person had understood for more than 2,000 years, and it was going to break something open in him that he could never quite put back together. To understand why, you have to understand who he was, because George Smith had no business being in that room at all. He was not a gentleman scholar. He had not gone to Oxford or to Cambridge. He was the son of a working-class family, and at the age of 14 he had been apprenticed to a printing firm, where he learnt to engrave the fine lines of banknotes onto metal plates. It was patient, precise, exhausting work, and it gave him two things that would change history: a steady eye for the smallest of marks, and a hunger to do something larger with his short life. He began spending his lunch breaks at the British Museum, standing before glass cases filled with broken tablets that had been carried back from the deserts of what is now Iraq. The writing on them was called cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay, and almost no one alive could read it. So Smith taught himself, alone. A dead language, in a script with no living speakers, dug out of cities that had been silent for thousands of years. The tablets had come from the ruins of Nineveh, from the library of an Assyrian king named Ashurbanipal, who had gathered tens of thousands of clay documents into one place more than 25 centuries ago. When his empire fell, the library burned, the ceilings caved in, and the fire baked the clay hard. That fire is the only reason any of it survived. The tablets reached London in crates, most of them never read by modern eyes, and Smith was hired to sort them. There were so many fragments that the work could have swallowed a lifetime. Thousands of broken pieces, with no labels and no order, each one a sentence or two from a world that had ended long before Rome was even a village. Most men would have seen only tedium. Smith saw a door, and then, one day late in 1872, he picked up the fragment now catalogued as K3375. According to his own account, he was sorting the pieces into categories, mythology in one pile, history in another, when his eye snagged on a few words. A ship, a mountain, a bird sent out across the water, returning because it found nowhere to land. He knew those words. Every church-going person in Victorian England knew those words. They were the story of Noah, of the ark coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat, of the dove released to test the falling flood. Except this was not the Bible. This was Assyrian clay, older than any Bible he had ever held in his hands. Much of the text was buried under a hard crust of grime. He could see that the story went on, but he could not read it, and the one man who could clean the tablet was away. So George Smith, who was not by nature a calm man, had to wait. By the accounts of those who knew him, his nerves were strung like piano wire for days. When the tablet was finally clean, he read it. And here's what the records describe next. Smith leapt up from his desk. He began pacing the room in a state of wild excitement. And then, in front of his astonished colleagues, he started to tear off his clothes. It remains, to this day, one of the strangest reactions to a piece of reading in the history of scholarship. The man believed he had found something that would shake the foundations of the modern world. What he had found was the 11th tablet of a 12-tablet epic, the story of a king named Gilgamesh, and buried inside it was a flood. A man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea, who whispers the secret through the wall of a reed house. He is told to pull down his home and build a boat. Not a long, narrow boat like Noah's, a perfect cube, each side around 120 cubits, roughly 180 feet, with 6 decks, 7 levels, and 9 compartments inside, every seam sealed watertight with black bitumen dragged up out of the ground. In the translation most scholars rely on today, made by the Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, the instructions are almost unnervingly precise, the vessel measured and stocked down to the last barrel of oil. He loads aboard his family, the craftsmen of his city, and the animals. The flood comes. The world drowns. And when it is over, the boat runs aground on a mountain called Nemush, and Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven does not return. The waters have gone down. Lay that story beside the story of Noah, and the parallels are almost unbearable. The warning, the boat, the animals, the mountain, the birds, released one by one. Notice what is missing from the version most of us were handed in childhood, any hint that it might not have come first. What strikes me most, though, is the audience. On the 3rd of December, 1872, Smith stood before the Society of Biblical Archaeology and read his translation aloud. Sitting in that room was William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Britain, and the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. They understood instantly what they were hearing. Here was the flood, the ark, the dove, written on clay that had been buried in the earth centuries before the first books of the Hebrew Bible were ever set down. Now, the way I read this moment, it was never really about whether a flood happened. It was about ownership. For 1,000 years, the Western world had assumed its oldest and holiest story belonged to it alone, original and unrepeatable. And a self-taught banknote engraver had just laid a shard of Assyrian clay on the table and shown that the same story had been told in another language to other gods, long before anyone wrote the name Noah. If you ask me, the panic was never about the flood itself. This wasn't the first time a people discovered that something they believed was uniquely theirs turned out to be inherited. But it may be the most personal version of that discovery, because this was scripture. This was the story they built their lives around. What this tells us is something uncomfortable about how stories move through the world. They do not respect borders or empires or even religions. They get copied, translated, reshaped, and passed down. And each people who receives the story comes to believe sincerely that it started with them. You might think this is ancient history, a quarrel for Victorian gentlemen in cold museum rooms. But ask yourself how many of the stories you carry as your own, the ones that feel like they could belong to no one else, were quietly handed to you by someone who got them from someone before. Smith would go on to talk a London newspaper into funding an expedition to Nineveh, where, against all odds, he dug more of the missing fragments out of the rubble. He died young, at 36, of fever in the same deserts he had spent his life trying to read. But the discovery he left behind carried a problem buried inside it, like a seed, because the tablet he found was not the original either. The Babylonians who wrote it had inherited their flood from someone older still. History doesn't teach us that we are original. It teaches us that we are inheritors. And the story George Smith believed he had reached the bottom of ran deeper than he ever knew, down into the black mud of the oldest cities on Earth, where it had been waiting in the dark the whole time. Everyone thinks they know why the flood came. Human beings turned wicked. A righteous God, heartbroken and furious, looked down at the cruelty and the lies and decided to wash the whole world clean and begin again. That is the reason given in the book of Genesis. It is the reason in the Sunday school telling, in the children's picture books, in the stained glass of 1,000 churches. The flood is a punishment. The flood is justice. But that is not the oldest version of the story. And the oldest version gives a reason for the end of the world so strange and so completely unlike the one we were taught, that once you have heard it, you can never read the flood the same way again. To find it, we have to leave the cold museums of London behind and go down into the mud of the first cities human beings ever built. Before Babylon, before Assyria, before the Hebrews had written a single word, there was Sumer. Roughly 5,000 years ago, in the flat, hot land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, people built the first cities on Earth. They invented writing. They invented the wheel, the law code, the school, even the humble receipt. They drained the marshes, dug the canals, and raised brick temples that climbed out of the plain like artificial mountains. They called themselves, in their own language, the black-headed people. And they had gods, not distant, abstract gods, but loud, hungry, quarreling gods who behaved a great deal like the people who imagined them. There was An, the sky. There was Enki, god of the deep waters and of wisdom, clever and quietly sympathetic to humankind. And above the rest loomed Enlil, god of wind and storm and earth, powerful, short-tempered, and very easily annoyed. Beside them stood Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, who had shaped the first human beings out of river clay. Remember Enlil. He matters most of all. The Sumerians believed their cities had been handed down from the gods, the very first of them, a place called Eridu. And in their telling, there was a man, a king and a priest, who lived in a city called Shuruppak on the banks of the Euphrates. His name was Ziusudra, which means something close to life of long days. He is the oldest named flood survivor in all of human history, older than Utnapishtim, older by far than Noah. We know his story from a single broken tablet. It was dug out of the ground at a site called Nippur in 1893, and it was so badly damaged that nearly 2/3 of the text is simply gone. The German scholar Arno Pobel was the first to publish it in 1912. Much later, the great Sumerologist Thorkild Jacobsen gave it the name we still use, the Eridu Genesis. What survives describes the creation of people and animals, the founding of the first cities, and then a flood decreed by the gods that Ziusudra alone is warned to escape by building a great boat. But here's what makes the Eridu Genesis so maddening. The part of the tablet that would tell us why the gods sent the flood is one of the parts that broke away. It is lost. For the reason, we have to turn to the story's close cousin, a Babylonian poem called the Atrahasis, which tells the same tale in fuller form. According to a note its own scribe left behind, the Atrahasis can be dated to within a few years of 1646, before the Common Era. And the reason it gives is astonishing. In the Atrahasis, the gods create human beings for one purpose: to do their labor, to dig the canals and grow the food so that the gods themselves can rest. And humans do the job. They do it so well that they thrive and multiply and fill the land. As their numbers swell, so does their noise. The endless din of human life, the shouting, the crying, the work and the festivals rises up to heaven and disturbs the sleep of Enlil. In the translation by the Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, the god finally snaps. The noise of mankind has become too much, he says. I am losing sleep over their racket. Read that again. The flood is not a punishment for sin. There is no sin. Humanity is not wicked in this version. Humanity is loud. We were drowned in the oldest telling, not because we were evil, but because we were inconvenient, because we kept a tired god awake. It is the god Enki, the one with the softer heart, who leaks the secret to the human hero, whispering it to the wall of a reed house so that, technically, he never betrays his fellow gods. And so the man builds his boat, and what a boat it was, though almost certainly not the boat you are picturing. In 2009, a curator at the British Museum named Irving Finkel was handed a small clay tablet that had been sitting unread in a private collection for decades. It dated to nearly 4,000 years ago, and it held something no one had ever seen: detailed building instructions for the Ark. Finkel laid out his findings in a book called The Ark Before Noah, and the vessel these instructions describe is not a long ship like Noah's, and not the towering cube of the Gilgamesh version. It is round, a giant coracle, a vast circular basket of woven palm rope, sealed with bathfuls of hot bitumen, as wide across as a small field. Finkel worked out its floor at roughly 2/3 the area of a modern football field, ringed by a tall wall of rope and reed and tar. What this tells us is that even the shape of the boat was never fixed. The story changed in the retelling every single time. If you ask me, that floating bowl is the most revealing detail of all. Now, the way I read this, the difference between a flood sent for noise and a flood sent for sin is not a small detail. It is the entire meaning of the story. When the Hebrews inherited this flood, centuries later, they did something profound with it. They kept the boat, the animals, the birds, the mountain, but they threw out the reason and replaced it. Out went the petty, sleepless god, annoyed by the racket of his servants. In came a moral universe, a god who floods the world because human beings have grown cruel, and who afterward makes a promise never to do it again. What strikes me most is that this was not a copying error, it was a decision. Someone took an old story about gods who saw people as cattle and rebuilt it into a story about a god who held people to a moral law. The water stayed the same. The meaning of the water changed completely. This wasn't the first time a culture reached back into an older tradition and remade it to mean something new, and it would not be the last. But notice what is really being argued about underneath the water. It is not the flood at all. It is the question of what we are. Are human beings a nuisance to be managed, or souls to be judged? 4,000 years ago, two civilizations gave two different answers and poured those answers into the very same story. You might think this is ancient history, but every time someone speaks of human population itself as the problem, too many mouths, too much noise, too much strain on a tired planet, you are hearing the voice of Enlil, lying awake in the dark, wishing we would all be quiet. When the waters fell, the Sumerians said, Ziusudra did not come to rest on a mountain like Noah or like Utnapishtim. He was carried instead to a place called Dilmun, a paradise where the sun rises, and there the gods granted him eternal life, the one gift they could offer a man they had nearly destroyed by accident. It is a strange, haunting, deeply human story. But for thousands of years, that is all it was, a story. Pressed into clay, buried, forgotten, dug up again, and argued over by scholars in faraway museums. One question always remained, simple and stubborn. Was there ever any water at all? Or did the first civilization on Earth invent the end of the world out of nothing? Beneath the sand, the ground itself had been keeping an answer. The spade went through the clay and hit nothing. For 8 feet, the workman had been digging through the same thing, a dense, sterile, grey-green mud, without a single sign that a human being had ever existed. No pottery, no bone, no ash, only clean, water-laid earth, packed hard, going down and down beneath the floor of the desert. And then, suddenly, the blade broke through into something softer, and there in the lamplight at the bottom of the pit lay the unmistakable signs of people. Broken pots, charcoal, the ordinary litter of a city that had been buried under 8 feet of flood-laid mud, and beneath that mud, another, older city still. It was the winter of 1928 in the far south of Iraq, at the bottom of a shaft sunk into the ruins of a place called and the man who climbed down to look believed, for a few short years, that he had found the physical proof of Noah's flood. His name was Leonard Woolley, and by then he was among the most famous archaeologists alive. For 7 years, beginning in 1922, Woolley had been excavating on behalf of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, and what he had pulled from the ground was extraordinary. He had uncovered the Great Ziggurat, the stepped temple mountain that still rises from the Iraqi plain today. He had opened the royal cemetery, hundreds of graves, and in the richest of them, the so-called death pits, he had found gold helmets, jeweled headdresses, lyres inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, and the skeletons of servants who appeared to have gone down into the earth alongside their masters. In one pit alone, he counted the remains of dozens of attendants, laid out in careful rows, as though they had walked down into the grave and quietly lain themselves down to die. Woolley had a gift, his colleagues said, for making the ancient world feel as real and as close as the room he was standing in. By the end of the decade, he had dug down through the cemetery to a depth of around 40 feet, and he made a decision. He would keep going. He would dig below the graves of the kings, into the layers that came before them, to find out what lay at the very bottom of the oldest city. He ordered a narrow shaft driven into the earth, and it was at the bottom of that shaft that his workmen struck the clay. At first, Woolley was not sure what he was seeing. The clean band of silt was thick, and it was empty, and it sat between two layers that were crowded with human life. So he widened the pit, eventually opening a hole some 75 feet by 60, and drove it down more than 60 feet in all. The pattern held. A prosperous settlement on top, 8 feet of barren, water-laid mud in the middle, and another settlement, older and stranger, sealed away underneath. There is a story, often retold, about what happened next. Woolley brought his wife Catherine to the edge of the pit and asked her what she made of it. She looked down at that great sterile band of clay and said simply, "Well, of course, it's the flood, and here's what makes that moment matter." Woolley agreed with her. In 1929, he announced to the world that he had found the physical trace of a single catastrophic deluge, the very flood remembered in the Book of Genesis and in the older Sumerian records. The newspapers seized on it. After all the centuries of argument, here at last was dirt you could touch, a flood you could measure with a ruler, 8 feet of it lying exactly where the holy books said a flood should be. It was a beautiful conclusion, and the way I read it, it was almost certainly wrong. Because as other archaeologists sank their own deep shafts across southern Iraq, the story refused to line up. A few hundred miles away, at a site called Kish, they found a flood layer too. At a third city, called Shurupak, they found yet another. And when the dates were compared, the floods did not match. They had struck at different times in different centuries. There was no single sheet of water that had drowned all of Mesopotamia in one night. There were many floods in many places across many generations, exactly what you would expect on a flat land threaded by two great and unpredictable rivers. Woolley himself, to his lasting credit, came to accept this. He quietly withdrew his grand claim, admitting that his clay layer was far too old to be the biblical flood, and that it had not even covered the whole of let alone the world. The pottery lying directly beneath his floodband belonged to the Ubaid people, the earliest settlers of the southern marshes, which meant the deluge he had measured was older than the Sumerian civilization itself. But notice what is hiding inside that disappointment, because one of those flood layers did not look like the others. At Shurupak, the very city the oldest legends name as the home of Ziusudra, the flood survivor himself, archaeologists found a band of river silt sealed beneath the ruins. Modern radiocarbon dating places it at around 2,900 years before the Common Era, nearly 5,000 years ago. Directly below it lay the painted pottery of the age just before. Something had drowned Shurupak, the legendary home of the man who built the boat, right around the moment the king lists insist the flood took place. If you ask me, that single coincidence of place is the most haunting detail in the entire search. It was not a flood that swallowed the world, but it may have been the real one, the flood that an actual city lived through and never stopped talking about. Here is the thing we get wrong when we argue about whether the flood really happened. We picture the whole planet submerged, and then, when the geology tells us that never occurred, we throw out the entire story as a fairy tale. But that is not how memory works, and it is not how catastrophe feels. Put yourself inside the mind of a farmer in Shurupak nearly 5,000 years ago. You live on a dead flat plain, in a town of mud brick, between two rivers you cannot control. One spring, the water begins to rise, and it does not stop. It climbs past the fields, it climbs past the doorways. It swallows the temple, the granary, the homes of everyone you have ever known, and it keeps coming until there is nothing in any direction but a brown, churning sea. Every person, every animal, every landmark of your whole world gone in a single night. What strikes me most is that, to that farmer, the distinction we obsess over would mean nothing at all. Local flood, global flood, who cares? His world ended, all of it, and the survivors who crawled back onto the mud when the water fell did exactly what human beings have always done. They told the story, they told it to their children, and the children told it bigger, until a drowned river valley slowly became a drowned earth. What this tells us about memory is that it never simply records, it magnifies. You might think this is ancient history, but we still do this, every one of us. We still take the worst night of our lives and, in the retelling, quietly turn it into the end of everything. So the water was real, even if the world it drowned was only one corner of a vast plain. The scar Wooly found in the earth was real too, just not the scar he had hoped for. And somewhere under Shurupak, the mud still holds the exact shape of the day a city died. History doesn't teach us that our oldest stories are lies. It teaches us that they are something more unsettling. The truth, swollen, grief and terror stretched across thousands of years until they finally touched the sky. The flood happened, not to the world, to a world, and the people who lived through it did the most human thing imaginable. They refused to let it be forgotten. They pressed it into the wet clay while the memory was still raw enough to hurt. In a glass case, in a room near the heart of the British Museum, there is a piece of broken clay no larger than something you could cradle in both hands. Barely 6 inches across and just over an inch thick, a fragment, really, of what had once been a larger whole. It is brown, the edges are chipped, one whole corner has broken away, and the surface is scarred where an ancient fire once baked it hard. If you walked past it without knowing, you would never look twice. It sits in room 55, among hundreds of other fragments, behind glass kept at a careful temperature, tagged with nothing grander than a plain museum number. The British Museum calls it the most famous cuneiform tablet in the world, and pressed into its face, in tiny wedge-shaped marks made by a nameless scribe more than 2,500 years ago, is the oldest surviving written account of the end of the world. This is the Flood Tablet, and the story it carries had already been ancient for thousands of years before it was ever pressed into this particular piece of earth. The tablet was found in the ruins of Nineveh in the burned library of an Assyrian king and carried to London in a crate among thousands of others. For years it lay unread. Then a self-taught scholar named George Smith picked it up, brushed away the grime, and recognized something that stopped his breath. A man, a boat, a bird sent out across the water. He had found a flood older than the Book of Genesis, and the discovery made him famous and, for a moment, broke something open in the Victorian world. But the tablet Smith held was only the most visible link in a chain that ran back much further than he could see. The Assyrians who copied it had inherited the story from the Babylonians. The Babylonians had inherited it from the Sumerians, the first city builders on earth, who told of a priest-king named Ziusudra and a flood sent not as punishment, but because the gods could not sleep through the noise of mankind. Follow the thread back, and it runs from Nineveh to Babylon to the oldest cities in the world, and then it vanishes into the silence that came before writing itself. 5,000 years, one story, passed from hand to hand, language to language, god to god, like a single candle lit from another, and another, and another, all the way down the long dark corridor of human time. So here is the question worth sitting with. Why this story? Of all the things human beings could have chosen to carry across 5,000 years, why did they hold so tightly to the memory of a flood? If you ask me, the answer says as much about us as it does about them. Part of it is that the story kept changing just enough to stay alive. Look at how much it adapted. The shape of the boat changed, from a round coracle of woven rope to a towering cube, to the long rectangular ark of Noah. The names changed, from Ziusudra to Atrahasis, to Utnapishtim to Noah. The gods changed, from a quarrelsome committee of Sumerian deities to a single god who drowns the world and then regrets it. Even the reason changed, from divine annoyance to divine justice, a story that rigid would have snapped. This one bent and lived. But survival alone does not explain its grip on us. Here's what I think the deeper reason is. The flood is not at its heart a story about water. It is a story about how thin the floor is beneath a civilization. The Sumerians knew something we work very hard to forget, that everything they had built, the cities, the temples, the granaries, the laws, the writing, could be erased in a single season by a river that did not care. They lived with that knowledge, and so they did the only thing that has ever really protected anyone. They turned the terror into a story and handed it down, generation after generation, as a warning. Build the boat before the rain. Remember that the water always comes back. Notice what survives in every single version, no matter how much else is stripped away. A warning ignored by almost everyone. A few who listen, a vessel built in time, and on the far side of the catastrophe, a fragile new beginning. According to the records the Sumerians left, the survivor does not save only his own family. He saves the animals. He saves the craftsmen, the people who know how to make things. In the Hindu telling, the survivor saves the sacred knowledge itself. The message buried in every version is the same. When the water comes, you do not only save lives, you save the things that let a civilization begin again. You save what you know. There is something almost unbearable in that when you sit with it. The people who first told this story are gone. Their cities are mounds of dust in a country torn by modern wars. Their gods are worshipped by no one. Their language fell silent for 2,000 years until a banknote engraver in London taught himself to read it again. Everything about them has vanished, everything except the one story they decided was too important to lose. And they were right. What strikes me most, looking at this thread across 5,000 years, is that it is not really a record of a disaster. It is a record of resilience. It is the longest unbroken act of remembering in human history, a species reminding itself over and over in every language it ever invented how to survive its own undoing. Every retelling was a kind of insurance, a message thrown forward to descendants the teller would never meet, trusting that someday, somewhere, someone would need to know how the last world ended. You might think this is ancient history, a fear that belongs to people in mud brick towns who did not understand the weather. But pull back, and the flood is everywhere in the present tense. We have only changed its name. We call it a pandemic, and watch a single invisible thing empty the streets of every city on earth. We call it a collapse, and watch a lifetime of savings vanish between a Friday and a Monday. We call it the climate, and argue about how high the water will rise and how soon. The costumes change. The dread does not. We are still the farmer on the flat plain, watching the river, wondering if this is the year it does not stop. And here is the deeper truth the Sumerians pressed into the clay, the one that should stay with you long after the lamp goes out. They did not believe the flood was a single event safely behind them. They built an entire civilization knowing it would come again. That is the difference between them and us. We like to tell ourselves the catastrophe is over, that we are the generation that finally outran the water. They knew better. The flood is not a thing that happened, it is a thing that happens. And the only ones who ever come through it are the ones who, like a priest king in a doomed city 5,000 years ago, are quietly building the boat while everyone else insists the sky is clear. So go and look at it if you ever have the chance. Room 55. The broken tablet behind the glass. A thin slab of river mud, chipped and scorched, and nearly 5,000 years old, small enough to hold in your hands. And yet the marks pressed into its face are still legible. A nameless person in a city that no longer exists wrote down the heaviest memory our species carries, and that memory outlived the scribe, the king, the library, the empire, and every language any of them ever spoke. History doesn't teach us that we are permanent. It teaches us that we are fragile, and that the one thing we have ever managed to send safely through the flood is the story of the flood itself, cradled in a piece of baked earth, light enough to hold in your hands and heavy enough to carry the weight of the world. The candle burns low, the questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.